The hypervisor is the software that allows you to run one or more guest operating systems on a single computer. And because of this, it's known as the Virtual Machine Manager, or VMM. So a VMM, hypervisor, it's the same thing. So that hypervisor is that actual software you're going to use. And there's two types. Type 1 is known as the native hypervisor, which is also known as a bare metal hypervisor, meaning that it runs directly on the hardware of the computer. There's no software intervention with this. The software of the hypervisor runs directly on the hardware of the computer. So that's the more powerful type. Examples of this include VMware's vSphere and also Microsoft's Hyper-V for Windows Server. The other is type 2, which is the hosted hypervisor. The hosted hypervisor is something that runs inside of your operating system. And examples of this include Oracle's VirtualBox and also Microsoft's Windows Virtual PC. Now, this is not as powerful. If you need to run critical systems, you're going to want a Type 1 hypervisor. If you're doing some testing or you want to learn about operating systems, then Type 2 is fine. Let's show a couple examples on the internet of both types of hypervisor software. The first here is VMware and their vSphere software. That is a very common type of hypervisor. That's a Type 1 hypervisor. It would be used in cloud computing and by web hosts and large enterprise networks that are going to run servers and client operating systems from a single server using a hypervisor. So that's VMware's example. And Microsoft's example is Hyper-V, which can work on Windows Server 2008 or higher. And it's the same type of thing. It runs bare bones. It's right on the hardware of the server. So this is a very powerful program that requires a powerful processor or more than one. For example, an Intel Xeon processor and tons of RAM. We're talking anywhere from 384 gigabytes to a terabyte of RAM on these servers. They need to be really powerful so that they can give resources, enough resources to all of the clients that will run on them. So those are two examples of the Type 1 hypervisor. And Hyper-V also has a version for the client. For Windows 8 and higher, there's Client Hyper-V. And it's basically the same type of software. It allows you to run one or more operating systems as guests, but this is done within Windows 8 or whatever newer version of Windows you're running. So this is more of a Type 2 hypervisor. It's really hosted. So Client Hyper-V looks the same, but architecturally it doesn't work the same way as the server-based Hyper-V. It's something you want to keep in mind. Other examples of Type 2 hypervisors include Oracle's VirtualBox, and this is a great program. We're going to show Hyper-V on Windows 8. We're going to show VirtualBox in the following sublesson, and then there's also Microsoft's Virtual PC. So you've seen all the types and you've seen the links there if you want to find out more about them or work with them. Now, Hyper-V for Windows 8 comes with the software if you're running Windows 8 or 8.1 Pro or Enterprise. And Oracle VirtualBox and Windows Virtual PC are free downloads. So you can run a Type 2 hypervisor for free if you want to on your system. And I recommend it. It's a great way to study the different operating systems that we work with in this course. So know the difference between Type 1 and Type 2 hypervisors. Type 1, once again, is native, and it's known as bare metal, runs directly in conjunction with the hardware of the computer. Type 2, that's hosted, and it runs internally within your operating system. So it's not going to perform nearly as well as Type 1, but it's a little bit easier to use and configure. Now, one other thing we need to talk about is extensions. In order to use virtualization software, your computer has to be compatible. That means the CPU needs to have the right code, the right extensions to work with that software, to work with that hypervisor software. And you may need to turn these extensions on in the motherboard UEFI or BIOS. For example, if you have an Intel-based system, you're going to use the VT-X extension for the CPU, and you'll use other extensions for the chipset. For example, for input-output memory management, you'll use VT-D, and for network management, you'll use VT-C. So you want to make sure these are enabled in the motherboard, especially VT-X. And it might just say, you know, VT, it just might say virtualization, and that's what you have to turn on. It depends on the firmware that you're working in. On the AMD side, you have other extensions, and for the CPU, it would be AMD-V, and for the chipset, it would be AMD-VI. So if you have an AMD CPU, you're going to use these. And if you have an Intel CPU, you're going to use these. Just again, you need to make sure that the CPU you're using can handle these extensions, has these extensions available to you. Quite often on a Type 1 hypervisor, you can't just use any old CPU. You can't just get yourself a Core i5 and think that it's going to work. You may need a specific type of CPU like a Xeon CPU. So make sure that you're using the right CPU based on the hypervisor you want to run, and in addition, make sure that you turn on the correct extensions for the CPU and for the chipset, and you do that in the motherboard's firmware, in your BIOS or UEFI. So that's about it for this sublesson on hypervisors, and in the next sublesson, we're going to actually show some of the virtual software and show you how that works.